Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this great Monday morning. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank Dr. Eiler for joining us and, for another webinar on the economy, as well as one of our other sponsors, Kaiser Marston. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Eiler. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Folks, if you have any questions, please use the chat functionality, and Vicki will come back at the end and we will go through your questions. Thank you again for coming today, and I want to thank Kaiser Marston Associates and Shaban for being partners on this. Let's talk about where we're headed, folks, in terms of this is the agenda. There's some really nasty job numbers that have come out. May is going to be worse. So later in June, we're going to see some numbers about the month of May that are going to, sort of pile on top of the nasty numbers from April. But we all kind of expected that. As economists, we knew that assuming that we were going to start to open up sometime in the spring, that April and May were going to probably be the nastiest months we were going to see. And of course, I'll come back to the economics of reopening and some of the things we've seen as places have started to slowly and tentatively reopen. But we're watching jobs very closely as that happens, and we're also trying to watch the economics of reopening in such a way as how is that going to ultimately affect forecasts. When you think about what actually needs to be done from an economic development standpoint, the key right now is business preservation. The job losses are things we knew were going to happen. The magnitude of them is startling, and just thinking about the evolution of those jobs coming back may also startle you a little bit. But if we start to lose businesses, that's where things get very tricky. So policy at the federal level is trying to preserve business capacity. If you come to some of these previous Shaban concept webinars with me, I've talked a lot about this. I'm going to talk about it again very briefly. But we've also had some unfortunate lessons here in California. Lassen County, for example, attempted to open up and is now shut down again, or about to do that, or at least tentatively opened in such a way that it acts as a cautionary tale about what needs to happen. So the other thing to think about too, and I'll talk about this at the end, is as we're reopening, we need to think about how municipal costs and benefits are going to come. And the protests we've seen over the last 6 or 7 days suggest that other costs are coming. I talked about civil unrest initially as an additional municipal cost, mainly around people being cooped up. And now it's somewhat been exacerbated by what's happened with the George Floyd situation. Unfortunately, it's just really a disastrous situation. But let's talk about recovery and the tale of three policies. Just to remind you, this is monetary and fiscal policy waiting to happen as we reopen, with the nasty social policy still with us. And as we're slowly reopening, the size of that circle should shrink, and the sum of the other circles should rise against it in such a way that we will eclipse the negatives, but it might take a long time. And that's really one of the biggest issues, is how long is it going to take for us to recover, and in what ways can we see the signs of that recovery? Well, right now we're in the decision process on reopening. And just to remind you, there's these costs and benefits, which probably is not a major intellectual stretch for you, but the idea is exactly where should you be looking for where the costs are going to be the most focused and where the benefits are going to be the most obvious. Well, we don't want to reinfect. In other words, we don't want to see cases spike again, because most public health officials have told us that if we start to reopen, there's going to be certain parameters, mainly around infection rates vis-a-vis the population and how our healthcare systems are impacted, and we don't want to shut down again as a result of hitting those parameters. Finally, we don't want to exacerbate the cost of doing business any more than we have to. That's an absolute critical factor here. But we're trying to get those jobs and spending started again, get the tax revenues going. We want to get around the point where the virus is going to affect us. So part of it is reopening, making adjustments, and in a sense, hoping either we get a vaccine, which looks less likely by the end of this year, or making adjustments in our businesses, in other words, to make ourselves more productive under the new scenarios. Finally, though, and this is the cool thing, is we might see some more businesses come out of this in terms of if there's more business costs that have suddenly come onto businesses basically worldwide. Will we see innovation and adaptation in such a way that will create new business opportunities through entrepreneurship that can lead to more business capacity in the longer run? And that's the key, is we just need to get started. I'll come back to that issue in a little while. Just a quick look at the updated information, at least we're getting it from EDD and other sources. This is the evolution of US weekly new claims, and this is just through last week. So you can see that we maybe have peaked in this cycle already, and these are weekly data, folks. So this is not, monthly, quarterly, annual, which I've shown the history of before. This is actually week by week what we're getting reported. And these are the actual number of people, and you can see we've gone straight up the hill and are slowly descending, and this is good. This is actually good news, even though you see that far right-hand number, still over 2 million people in 1 week getting or losing their job. It suggests that we're starting to get that major clearing of the market, and then we will figure out the total magnitude of the change and then hopefully start to see some recovery. This is California in contrast. Same basic progression, a little bit bumpy here on last couple of weeks, but still way down from the peaks. We had a small adjustment to the original estimate of gross domestic product growth after inflation in Q1. You can see it's 5% negative, which is the far right-hand side. Here are the last 3 recessions. These data are from 1990 on a quarterly basis. So it actually went down from 4.8, another 0.2% worse than we originally thought. And some of that is because when you're doing those estimates, you're looking at employment. And as the employment numbers become a little bit more, we're going to move more from an initial estimate to something that is a little bit more concrete. The Bureau of Economic Analysis that does this for the United States economy tends to do a second and third estimate that's a little bit different. This time it went a little bit worse. And that's true. And that doesn't make, it makes a lot of sense with the idea that the job losses are actually more severe than most economists perceive they would be. But with that said, let's think about a forecast. This actually came out about 2 weeks ago. And this forecast suggests where we may be headed over the next few quarters. Notice that second column. This is a forecast by 40 forecasters. This is actually the middle of that forecast. There's a survey that goes out by the Philadelphia Federal Reserve that asks 40 economists. All they do is look at the US economy. The old forecast from before COVID-19 is in the first column. The new forecast really after April 30, is in the second column. So you can see they're looking from the second quarter forward of 2020, and they have negative 32.2 as the contraction in the second quarter. Well, we just saw the contraction in the first quarter is probably negative 5%. So negative 32.2 suggests that most of the pain is going to happen in the second quarter, and that makes a lot of sense. It was in March when a lot of this started, and you can see that the negative 5 is really driven by what happened in middle of March forward. Since April and May and probably part of June now are going to be relatively shelter-in-place times, regardless of the opening of the economy, we're going to have a lot of nasty contraction. About a third of the economy has gone away in this first episode. I'm sorry, in this first major quarter of change. Then third and fourth quarters, and then the first quarter of next year, they'll look pretty good in sense of coming out of the hole, and that's key. But if you go down, we'll see this in a minute, we're still going to have a negative year this year. What juxtaposed that productivity change is what's happening in labor markets overall. So the unemployment rate is shown in the second panel, and you can see before COVID-19, pretty much cruising at full employment. After, way up in terms of unemployment, which again makes sense. But that nastiest quarter, the second quarter, 16.1, we will see when May numbers come out, and then we will see how we might have to adjust this a little bit. But by June 30, 16.1 was the middle forecast, not the only forecast, but the middle of that 40-person forecast distribution. And then it starts to float down. So regardless of the tails, in other words, the better or worse from that middle, we start to see general ideas that we're going to float down from there, which corroborate the evidence, or at least the forecast from productivity on the left-hand side. And then the annual piece really tells the longer-term tail. So negative year this year, meaning that we're not going to quite dig ourselves out of the hole, even though the third and fourth quarters are relatively positive. But then 21 through 23 looks pretty good in terms of getting back to square and slowly evolving. But that's only one part of the story. The second part of the story is what's going to happen with unemployment and thinking forward. Well, you're going to see that drift down, totally following the idea that our economy is growing, but it's not going to quite get back down to where we thought we were going to be. But for COVID-19, it's going to be about a little over 1% more unemployment by 2023. So we will not quite get back to baseline in the middle forecast by these forecasters. This is generally a pretty good set of forecasters in terms of how previous forecasts have set themselves up with what really happened. It looks like it might be 2024 where we actually get fully back to baseline. So is this going to be kind of a long slog? And the answer is yes. When you have this much change in labor markets, you have to expect a slow evolution out. Well, let's look quickly at the US overall in terms of the April numbers and see where a lot of the action happened. The darker states are where the unemployment rate was larger than the other ones. And you can see the little legend at the bottom there and how much different some states are than others. So here's just a rundown. For April 2020, the US is at 14.7%. California was at 15.5%, and that's after seasonal adjustment. This is the actual number stated was 16.1. Connecticut, 7.9, Oregon, 14.2, Washington, 15.4, and then Nevada, 28.2. So in Nevada, because it has so much exposure on the tourism side, even though it has balanced its economy out over the last 7 or 8 years, the Nevada state unemployment rate is relatively large, way bigger than we thought it was going to be. But if you notice, sort of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, we're all kind of in the low 20s or high teens, and that's why they're dark like Nevada in terms of the change. But Nevada was by far the largest unemployment rate in the United States. And what does this do? I want just to remind people, these data, when you hear them in the news, do not include the self-employed or the part-time workers. Those are counted other ways. And you have to think that if people are losing payroll jobs and a lot of demand are in personal services for self-employed or in retail or in, let's say, restaurant delivery or some other piece of transportation, that all those markets are moving around relatively quickly. And it's been very tricky to follow part-time and self-employed work. We just don't do it very well as economists. It's one of the real drags on our science. We haven't been able to solve that puzzle easily to keep up on it on a regular basis. And a lot of it's because the data are hard to collect. Okay, so with all that change in mind, let's break it down a little bit and look at the industrial level change in the data. This is the major industries in the United States and also in California moving from worst case, or sorry, from the best case in terms of what happened in April 2020 to the worst, but then looking at non-farm right off the top, or let's say the total non-farm employment change. So for the US is a little over 12%. For California is a little bit over 13. But then you see going forward, going to the right-hand side, there's a bunch of differences between what happened in April for California versus the US. But if you go to the far right-hand side where most of the damage has happened, retail is a little bit worse. Other services, personal services, meaning hair salons, nail salons, yoga studios, fitness centers, auto shops in some cases, and then leisure and hospitality, which is really the mix of hotel and restaurant and attractions employment. It actually is kind of intriguing that California did not suffer as much in April as other parts of the US, but certainly in other services, which is a larger part of the California economy than the US, we had a little bit worse time. So looking at all this, it just gives you a sense that a lot of different industries have been hurt by this. Looking at construction, which is kind of 2/3 of the way moving left to right, was also a little bit more hurt in California than the US. Other parts of the US kind of kept construction going a little bit, or in some cases completely. Solano County, for example, in California, has kept construction going the whole time, which may help their economy turn more quickly. But the key here is to watch these in terms of economic development. Where do we need triage the most? These data begin to show that our original estimates were correct, that the worst was going to be in retail, other services, and restaurants and hotels mainly. But there are other industries that are hurting. What I want to do now is sort of break this down on the goods market side, because to get out of a recession, generally economic development looks at construction and manufacturing as ways of breaking out because they have such larger economic impacts than, let's say, services generally do, except for, let's say, technology services. But if you look at where construction's really hurt in California in terms of April, we saw a contraction about 14.5% from the previous April. We just saw those data in the previous graph. But if you notice that on the bottom, where the change was the smallest, that's a lot of heavy construction versus the versus other types of contractors. A lot of it being inside the let's say the inside of a home or inside of a building, where you would have more proximity and thus you would not be able to conform to the public health rules. We saw a bigger contraction there. But this suggests that there is going to be a lot of labor waiting to go back to work in construction, and that's a good sign if we can get construction moving relatively quickly. Unfortunately, I mislabeled this one. This should have been manufacturing by sub-industry, not construction again. But here's manufacturing, and you can see where in terms of total manufacturing was negative 10.4% contraction. And then you go up, that bottom section is what we think of as durable manufacturing. So meaning that, you know, equipment, more advanced technology manufacturing. And we can see that in transportation and equipment and furniture and related products, we saw more of a contraction than, let's say, we saw in computer or in general wood products or in machinery, which is good in the sense there was some balance there. But if your local municipality is somewhat leaning toward those more on the furniture side, or let's say on transportation equipment, whether it be boats, planes, trains, cars, that's where a lot of it sort of sagged, at least in the initial piece. And a lot of that's demand driven. If you look at non-durable, which is the next panel up, apparel manufacturing just got hammered. And a lot of that was because they saw a contraction in demand. And then textile mills are generally connected to apparel manufacturing. So both of those saw some real comebacks in terms of where they had job loss. So when you think about that, again, there's going to be a lot of manufacturing unemployment. And then if manufacturing gets started, this will move very quickly back towards zero. And the good thing about that is ultimately is that we will see growth happen quickly. And I'll come back and talk about this as we talk about the economics of reopening to wrap up. Okay, so very quickly, this was the composition of the California economy before COVID, February 2020. Notice the pie chart. And then there's going to be some subtle changes here where the structure of the economy is suddenly shifting. And I'll talk about why this is important after I look at April, but just take that mental picture. And then there's April. So let me go back to February. Look at leisure and hospitality. 7.3% of the California economy in terms of total employment in April. In 2 months ago, it was 11.6%. So that is a serious contraction in terms of the mix in the state economy, and the pie is gotten smaller by about 14%. So that shift can easily change, and this is the big thing. For local municipalities, leisure and hospitality lead to a lot of different tax revenues, whether they be transient occupancy tax when people staying in hotels, taxable sales with respect to their spending, and let's say what an economist would call an inelastic fashion when they travel. If you look at that, or even going out to restaurants, you're going to be paying relative top dollar when you're moving around. If that contracts, it suggests a major contraction in budget. And this is part of the reason why the California state budget specifically, and other municipal budgets around the United States, are showing relatively nasty news for this coming up fiscal year and the next. Okay, let's look briefly at housing news. So this is actually a huge flip-flop. Zillow Research had a relatively optimistic forecast in March when COVID-19 started, with the idea that perhaps we would see some migration from the urban areas which were most threatened for infection and, let's say, long-term potential damage in terms of remaining in an urban area and moving more towards suburban and rural. Now they've gotten a little more pessimistic and a little bit more in line with other forecasts throughout the United States and in California, with relatively flat prices, but generally negative across California. And this shows across all the counties. And you can see that at the California average is just a little under or a little over 0.5% down. Some counties like Sacramento and Santa Clara actually have a little bit of a boost this year. But then Butte County and some of the more, let's say, northeastern and northern California counties are seeing a little bit of a comeback. It's not any of these are really not that big of a deal in terms of actual contraction on the negative side, but they do suggest that supply might slightly outpace demand for the next 12 months. Okay. So folks, can't say this enough. I say it every time I talk for Chabon. Depth and duration are really key. How deep are we going to go? And we've seen some really nasty numbers so far today in terms of the contraction. About 3 million people lost their job in terms of the April numbers. We think about 4.4 million have actually lost their job in the last 10 weeks if you look at what the unemployment insurance claims look like in California. So there's a lot of nasty numbers coming out. But the key now in terms of making the duration relatively short is how we reopen. So I've been doing this series now for the last couple of months, and what we're going to talk about now briefly is the economics of reopening, and this is why it's important to coordinate reopening among industries. Understanding the supply chains locally, what supply chains connect to what? In other words, if you open manufacturing, what else do you need to open to where the manufacturers are not looking outside the area for supplies or workers, and also have as many effects as they can locally. So construction and manufacturing tend to be drivers. In other words, when a new restaurant pops up, it doesn't lead to more construction or manufacturing. But when more construction and manufacturing open up, it can lead to new restaurants, or at least the support of restaurants that currently exist rather than the other way around. So it's critical to recognize that as local municipalities start to open up, how they open up and coordinate those reopenings give you the full economic impacts and try to drive your local economy back closer to baseline from where you started. So if you don't do it right, or you don't do it in a coordinated fashion, you will end up having a lot of stuff coming in from the outside just to, in a sense, keep demand going. And that can also lead to higher prices. And we don't want that to happen. So when local workers come back, it's the same thing. So if you think about that's the primary effect. The next effect is if I pay my workers, where are they spending their money? And if retail and restaurants and other parts of the economy are not reopened yet, we'll lose some of those effects to Amazon and an array of other places, and also just to pure savings because people are concerned about where the economy is going. We want to give people a reason to spend locally when they're going to spend. That's the key. So one of the things to think about is when restaurants and retail are not open at the same time, let's say construction and manufacturing reopen, does that mitigate local economic impacts? Absolutely. The problem is that retail and restaurants are places where people gather. So public health has a real conundrum on their hands at almost every single level of government, because you got to think about, you don't want to reinfect, and at the same time, you want to get things back open. This has been one of the serious frictions we've been watching. Tourism is probably the one big one that we're watching very closely. So the Lassen County example I talked to you about before, the movement of people around, once you start to open, say, okay, great, I can actually go someplace that's open and I can do something outside the house. That's super. You might get reinfected. So that two tragedies, that, you know, wanting something and then actually getting it and having to go back in the shelter in place if it's not done right. You got to watch that dichotomy very closely, because you want so badly to open it up. But if you do open up and you get what you've been trying to avoid, which is reinfection and ultimately shutting down again, that's a big problem. State of California in specific is being very cautious about that. And that's why the state budget is nasty. That is why this has been a very slow process. And this is why your governor has been speaking as much as he has been, because he wants to make sure that he's telling you everything he knows to make sure it comes out as cleanly as possible. But there's going to be some pain. Okay, so what to watch? I alluded to these numbers before. So the unemployment insurance claims are still focal for us. Some really wild numbers. 40.7 million people have asked for unemployment in the last 9 or 10 weeks in the US, about 4.6 million in California. But some of those folks have got their jobs back. So now we're starting to shift our focus more toward how is housing starting to move again? In other words, looking at construction. And the construction numbers are actually getting better across the United States as of last month. And then looking at continued claims. How long are people staying on unemployment? Again, that duration concept. The depth is bolded. The duration will be played out, and so-called continuing claims for unemployment insurance will then act as a precursor for a reduction of the unemployment rate. We got to get the policies lifted. So as the policies lifted, how well do we adapt? That's absolutely critical. What businesses will survive? So economic development, you think about that reopening piece. If businesses reopen and those other businesses that are in the secondary and tertiary rings around construction and manufacturing explicitly and specifically, if they're unable to open, they may not get the revenues to survive. And that's a critical factor in moving forward. And that's really what economic development has to do. How can you connect those dots locally in such a way that if everybody does start to open up, making sure that spending curves toward the local area? Well, folks, that's all I have for today as an update. Thank you again for attending. And Vicki, I'll take any questions we've gotten on the chat.
Okay, thank you. We have one question here. Just to confirm that the unemployment data does not include sole proprietors and independent contractors.
That is correct, and I shouldn't speak so generally. Cole, thanks for that question. It does count sole proprietors and independent contractors if they are payroll workers. So, for example, in the little business I have at home, my wife and I are W-2 workers for our business. So while we are in a sense sole proprietors, we are W-2 workers and end up in that payroll. If either one of us were, let's say, to shut down our business, that would be a loss of 2 jobs in that count. But generally speaking, those that are self-employed and those that are independent contractors are generating income in ways that do not show up on payroll surveys, and hence they are not counted.
Okay, thank you. And from Linda, what workforce development trends should we be aware of?
Great question, Linda. On the workforce development side, it's really about upskilling. We want to think about how, if we're moving toward a situation where people are going to be working from their homes more, or potentially seeing more automation, then shifting from jobs that are lost because of those changes towards something that supports people working from home, more automation, thinking on the coding side, or let's say on the coordination of warehousing. Those are kind of some of the workforce development trends that are emerging, as well as healthcare and potentially some in construction, depending on how the loss of construction jobs makes people walk away from the labor force because maybe they've been slowly waiting to retire. And then they do. If construction demand rises again, we might see some more construction needs in terms of skilled labor. So watch for that as well, but probably in coding and let's say STEM fields, and then ultimately in healthcare.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any suggestions on initiatives or efforts to drive spending locally?
Well, thanks, Michelle, for that question. It's one of those things where if you have kind of a go local initiative already in place, there's a lot of parts of California and around the United States have, let's say, spend local initiatives. A lot of it is the coordination effort between your local chambers of commerce, your local builders associations, and sort of putting all those people in a room and saying, guys, as much as we can, we've got to start spending among each other to try to circulate the dollars locally rather than just spill them out, because there's all kinds of incentives to solve problems quickly. That's why a lot of us have looked at, let's say, the Amazon platform as a way of bringing goods to home when we can't go out during shelter in place. it's been a great time for those kind of businesses to really cement market share, specifically away from our local businesses. So a lot of it is just getting the major players in the room who can move that information out and potentially coordinate that spending by looking at making larger, maybe bulk deals. If you know that there's going to be 100 homes built, then looking at how you can look at a local vendor and spend that money locally rather than push it out immediately. But that has to be a coordinated effort. So if everybody's running parallel lines and nobody's talking to each other, that's not going to make it happen. But there are a lot of go local initiatives. A lot of it is focused on retail. So thinking one level above that in terms of construction and manufacturing is a little bit more complex, but can keep more dollars circulating locally.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment on the time frame for manufacturing returning from other countries to the U.S.?
Great question, Mary. I cannot speak to it cogently right now because we don't know how much of it's going to come back. The federal government may provide incentives to speed that along, but the economics of bringing that back, especially as the East Asian economies come back up and want to sell those goods and keep their own places of business open, they're going to provide some pretty good pricing deals to keep that market share in place. And if prices go down, the potential return on investment from bringing that manufacturing back without some, let's say, outside subsidization may be very tricky. So it probably will be after and only if the federal government gets involved and says, we want to repatriate some of that manufacturing home. But historically speaking, even when we've had recessions that are relatively deep, let's say the Great Recession, it still takes a lot of change to reorient manufacturing once it's offshored. It is not just a snap of your fingers to bring that stuff back to where you can say, okay, in the next 6 or 9 months, we should expect healthcare machinery to be manufactured primarily in the United States for use in the United States. The calculus on that and the economics are likely to remain in East Asia's favor, at least for the next couple of years, especially if there's no federal subsidization to make that change and they become a lot more price competitive in the front end to preserve market share.
Okay, we have, excuse me, we have 2 questions related to the civil unrest from Kay and from Leslie. So the current demonstrations highlight some cracks in the economic ecosystem that have not been addressed and now add to a perfect storm, social and economic inequity. So how do these impacts affect the issues from COVID, and do they affect recovery?
Well, that's a great question. And it's so hard to answer that well, but in just the economic logic is kind of 2 ideas. One is that the timing of the change is something where if you're starting to open back up and then you've got a lot of municipal reaction and potentially some municipal lockdown as a result of the protest, that's going to be a sudden speed bump in reopening. So that could easily affect the timeline on recovery in the short term. History suggests it will not change the medium and long term yet. It depends on how proliferate and how generalized the protests become and how dramatic the changes are from those protests. And so that the trickiness here is that there will be some impacts. They historically have been relatively short term, but they also depend on how much longer it goes and how much damage is left in the wake. And the reasons behind it are strong. The overall effects on it can also be strong the longer it takes. So it definitely can act as a short-term speed bump, and it's really just something that we have to unfortunately kind of walk through because of the unfortunate decisions that have been made in terms of the way things happen with George Floyd. But then also thinking on the other side is we want our economies to reopen, but we've got to play this part because this is how America is in terms of our ability for free speech. It's a real friction in moving back forward. It's just a terrible situation and terrible timing.
Thank you. And again, from Mary, do you have any data or comment around citizens streaming over from Mexico that have dual citizenship as impacting the jobs and healthcare?
Mary, great question. I do not. And in fact, we're right now, most of the data suggests that we've had a lot lower flow, but what we don't know, of course, are let's say crossings that we don't measure. The supposition is that if you have dual citizenship, you have been able to flow over the border, but I don't know of any data that are actually connecting the flow of that of folks that are dual citizens over that are affecting jobs or healthcare yet. Those data will emerge over time, so we don't have much on that just now.
Okay. And looks like we have time for this one last question. What role does a vaccine have with the economic forecast for a full recovery? So if we have a vaccine in 2021, do you think that will be the catalyst for a shift in consumer behaviors?
That's an outstanding question, Barry. Thanks a lot for asking. One of the key factors in the vaccine is cleansing, in a sense, uncertainty. That assumes the vaccine works, we can generalize the use of that vaccine, and the economy agrees that it's working in such a way to not, or to reduce the probability of this happening again, and also the effects if it happens again. So it definitely is going to be a catalyst in shifting consumer behavior because, for example, if I'm concerned about going back into shelter in place and potentially losing my job or losing it again, I might slow down my spending in such a way to sort of bridge over that time. And that can elongate recession. So one of the things that we're concerned about is, and I said this a bunch of times today, the job losses becoming business losses, becoming job losses. Part of that is job losses are reduced and people come back to work. Are they spending in a way that can sustain businesses for some time to where if it does come back, or we get through this front time and get to a vaccine, we haven't had such a loss of capacity in our economy that we're going to recover more quickly, very quickly, once we feel like the problem is 100% gone. If we lose that business capacity, it's going to be still a slow slog. And some of that is very dependent on consumer spending.
Okay. Well, thank you. That, I believe, is our time. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us again this morning. Thank Dr. Eiler for his take on all of this crazy stuff, and for Chabin and for Kaiser Marston for sponsoring. Our next webinar will be 8:30 in the morning, Monday, June 22nd. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki. Take care, folks.